Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Abbott and Costello, from local burlesque to universal horror. After Bob Hope's successful forays into fright-tinged fun with The Cat and the Canary and The Ghost Breakers, a New Jersey duo, also from a variety background, would begin raising audiences and other spirits themselves. Abbott and Costello rang box office bells with their topical drafted soldier comedy Buck Privates in January of 1941. But in a few months, not long before their country would be dragged into the conflict, they began enlisting horror themes into their comedies that would extend their careers into a lucrative cross-genre appeal and re-enliven the fading fortunes not only of Universal Studios, but of the movie horror genre itself. As with Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello took some time as solo artists to find each other. William Bud Abbott was born into show business to circus parents working for Barnum and Bailey. His mother, Ray, was a bareback rider, while his father, Harry, worked as an advance man drumming up publicity. They moved to New York's entertainment beach complex Coney Island, where Harry set up the Columbia Wheel, the first burlesque circuit. Bud would skip school, preferring to gain an invaluable education hustling the audiences at the sideshows there. He started making money by tempting customers into the labyrinthine House of Mirrors, and then charged 10 cents to lead them out. There his con artist persona was formed. Burlesque would play an important role in the making of Abbott and his future partner. For the first half of the century, the theater scene could be split into 3 strata. At the top would be Broadway, with highbrow dramatic plays and lavish budgeted populist musicals. Below that was vaudeville, composed of touring variety shows featuring music and comedy, billed alongside all manner of specialty acts. At the lowest level was burlesque, provided by joints whose main attractions were striptease acts and dancers. One can only imagine the resilience these performers needed to survive the crude environment and impatience of the clientele. At the age of 16, Bud's father made him assistant treasurer at the Casino Theater in Brooklyn, where he continued to learn the ropes, absorbing the techniques and material of performers like W.C. Fields from the wings. From paying the acts, Bud graduated to being a producer of weekly Gals and Gags shows at the National Theater in Detroit that recycled the famous burlesque routines he'd learned from the masters, like the Sanatorium Crazy House and the Lemon Table Con, many of which he would later play in his future films and TV shows with Costello before audiences who had no idea of their stage origin. By 1918, he married a burlesque ingenue, Jenny May Pratt, whose stage name was Betty Smith. Meanwhile, he had begun his own double act. He developed into an intimidating straight man who would need a robust comic to endure the roughhouse physical bullying of his smooth-talking but threatening conman. Competition amongst comics for that role was greater than we might imagine, as the more violent he appeared to be, the greater the audience's sympathy for his shorter, dim-witted victim. Although back then, oddly, the straight man was regarded as the star name of the team, Abbott was always prepared for the laughs and attention to be garnered by his funny partner rather than him. To redress the balance, Abbott and Costello's business contracts would reflect a 60-40 split of the team's earnings in his favor, a common practice. Despite becoming the top straight man in the business, by the mid-1930s Bud Abbott still hadn't made it to the big time. But by hitting the right combination, as it were, all that was to change. Enter Louis Francis Cristello, better known as Lou Costello. The product of devout Catholics, an Irish-American mother, and an Italian immigrant father who worked in insurance, Lou shared his future partner's New Jersey roots, but not in show business. However, his obsession with Charlie Chaplin since childhood gave Lou a role model whose routines he would watch at the cinema repeatedly till he could imitate them much as Abbott would those of his stage peers. Fans who only know him as an older, tubby chap may be surprised what an accomplished athlete he was when young, a state basketball champion and gaining 11 wins out of 12 bouts as an amateur boxer. Sports, though, were only a sideline to Lou. His burning desire was to succeed as a movie star, and in 1927 he and a friend hitchhiked to Hollywood. His great ambition was a marked contrast from his much-loved screen persona as an unfocused dullard, being far more pushy in real life than Bud, a man more easily contented by nature than his ever-hustling stage self. This would prove to be a wedge between both men in time. In spite of his indomitable drive, overnight fame was not to be for Lou. Jim Mulholland's The Abbott and Costello book records how his youthful slim physicality earned him studio work, but after 18 months, Lou had sustained a number of injuries being tossed around the MGM backlot as a stuntman and extra. He gave up and returned home to regroup, bouncing back with customary confidence as a Dutch comic at the Lyceum. Dutch comedy was essentially German, Deutsch, a popular type of immigrant-focused repartee comedy of misunderstanding presented with makeup and extravagant accents. Gradually, Lou worked his way up the theatre ladder, becoming a comic at New York's Orpheum Theatre. By 1936, he'd adopted the name Lou Costello, and also parlayed his baby-faced innocence into valuable burlesque experience being pulverized nightly in famous routines. He was now at the same level in the business as Bud Abbott, two equal halves of an act who just needed to connect. They had crossed paths inevitably a number of times on the circuit, and realized with the prompting of industry friends that they were an ideal chemistry match. They officially became a team in the touring revue Life Begins at Minsky's in 1936, and whilst it certainly did begin for them professionally, it coincided with the end of burlesque in New York City. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia was forced to shut down these types of shows due to complaints about their perceived immorality, at the same time as a wave of Puritanism pressurized Hollywood into committing to its own code of conduct. Fortunately for Abbott and Costello, there would be new avenues for their brand of comedy, which by now had amassed such a huge repertoire of classic routines that, if necessary, they could perform for weeks without once repeating themselves. This would make them perfect for a growing medium that constantly required a turnover of fresh material for a demanding national audience. In other words, radio. They got their big break courtesy of comedian Henny Youngman, famed for his catchphrase, "Take my wife, please," who was supporting the title star of The Kate Smith Show in 1938. He'd secured a screen test at Paramount Pictures in Los Angeles, but could only be released if he found a replacement. Catching the boys' act at Lowe's State Theatre, he saw their madcap baseball sketch, Who's On First, and recalled, "I closed my eyes and I visualized that this could be very funny on radio." Thanks to him, that same routine was soon broadcast across the country by Ms. Smith's new supporting comedy duo. Radio was an ideal transition for their verbally based comedy, and led to them working in the medium for the next 13 years, including top-lining their own hit show The Abbott and Costello program from 1941, and for long after. Inadvertently, radio also helped Bud and Lou to crystallize their differing sound, as audiences initially complained that their voices were too alike to distinguish them. In response, Lou developed an exasperated falsetto that synced perfectly with childlike catchphrases such as, "I'm a bad boy," and the escalating panic bursting out of him in their later horror movies. The Lou Costello of the early radio years was in fact a very different persona to the film one, and indeed a world away from the real man. Instead of the cowardly, overgrown kid familiar to movie audiences, he was basically an insult comedian on the radio show, aiming caustic one-liners at everyone, including his partner. Imagine him trying that against the bullying film version of Abbott. Jim Mulholland's Abbott and Costello book, in covering their airwaves output, recounts the damage that did to his image. These Rickles-type barbs didn't fit him. He lost the audience's sympathy, which was so important to his kind of comedy. He was also portrayed as a libidinous girl chaser like Harpo Marx, which was again nothing like him in reality. The radio shows were constricting to the duo's facility for unscripted live lunacy, but did allow them some cheeky topical satire about World War II conditions. Bud and Lou stayed with the show for 2 years, whilst also appearing on Broadway in The Streets of Paris, a musical revue featuring Carmen Miranda. This was their passport to a one-picture deal at Universal Studios, where their first film was One Night in the Tropics. In spite of a music score by famed songwriter Jerome Kern, it was not a big hit, but the boys were. By showcasing to winning effect 5 of their burlesque classics, including a shortened Who's on First, the studio offered them their own star vehicle in Buck Privates. This wartime comedy of conniving and unwilling army draftees was an enormous hit, reputedly making $10 million at a time when a cinema ticket cost only 50 cents, and in major cities only being beaten by Gone with the Wind. Now Abbott and Costello had jointly hit the big time, and they reveled in it, making ever greater salary demands and living the high life as they built their massively profitable brand of comedy at the box office. It wasn't long before they would experiment with combining their tried-and-tested shtick with Universal's own trusted back catalogue, adding horror like many funny acts, yet to far greater success than any of their competitors. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.